"As to who or what Miss Hawkins is, or how long he has been acquainted with her," said Emma, "nothing, I suppose, can be known. One feels that it cannot be a very long acquaintance. He has been gone only 4 weeks." Nobody had any information to give, and after a few more wonderings, Emma said, "You are silent, Miss Fairfax, but I hope you mean to take an interest in this news. You, who have been hearing and seeing so much of late on these subjects, who must have been so deep in the business on Miss Campbell's account, we shall not excuse your being indifferent about Mr. Elton and Miss Hawkins." "When I have seen Mr. Elton," replied Jane, "I dare say I shall be interested; but I believe it requires that with me. And as it is some months since Miss Campbell married, the impression may be a little worn off." "Yes, he has been gone just 4 weeks, as you observe, Miss Woodhouse," said Miss Bates. 4 weeks yesterday. A Miss Hawkins! Well, I had always rather fancied it would be some young lady hereabouts. Not that I ever— Miss Cole once whispered to me— But I immediately said, No, Mr. Elton is a most worthy young man, but— In short, I do not think I am particularly quick at those sorts of discoveries. I do not pretend to it. What is before me, I see. At the same time, nobody could wonder if Mr. Elton should have aspired— Miss Woodhouse lets me chatter on so good-humouredly. She knows I would not offend for the world. How does Miss Smith do? She seems quite recovered now. Have you heard from Mrs. John Knightley lately? Oh, those dear little children! Jane, do you know I always fancy Mr. Dickson like Mr. John Knightley. I mean in person, tall, with that sort of look, and not very talkative." "Quite wrong, my dear aunt. There is no likeness at all." "Very odd! But one never does form a just idea of anybody beforehand. One takes up a notion, and runs away with it. Mr. Dickson, you say, is not, strictly speaking, handsome?" "Handsome? Oh, no, far from it. Certainly plain. I told you he was plain." "My dear, you said that Miss Campbell would not allow him to be plain, and that you yourself—" "Oh, as for me, my judgment is worth nothing. Where I have a regard, I always think a person well-looking. But I gave what I believed the general opinion, when I called him plain." "Well, my dear Jane, I believe we must be running away. The weather does not look well, and grandmamma will be uneasy. You are too obliging, my dear Miss Woodhouse, but we really must take leave. This has been a most agreeable piece of news indeed. I shall just go round by Mrs. Cole's, but I shall not stop 3 minutes, and Jane, you had better go home directly. I would not have you out in a shower. We think she is the better for Highbury already. Thank you, we do indeed. I shall not attempt calling on Mrs. Goddard, for I really do not think she cares for anything but boiled pork. When we dress the leg it will be another thing. Good morning to you, my dear sir. Oh, Mr. Knightley is coming too. Well, that is so very— I am sure if Jane is tired, you will be so kind as to give her your arm. Mr. Elton and Miss Hawkins. Good morning to you." Emma, alone with her father, had half her attention wanted by him while he lamented that young people would be in such a hurry to marry, and to marry strangers too, and the other half she could give to her own view of the subject. It was to herself an amusing and a very welcome piece of news, as proving that Mr. Elton could not have suffered long, but she was sorry for Harriet. Harriet must feel it, and all that she could hope was, by giving the first information herself, to save her from hearing it abruptly from others. It was now about the time that she was likely to call. If she were to meet Miss Bates on her way! And upon its being to rain, Emma was obliged to expect that the weather would be detaining her at Mrs. Goddard's, and that the intelligence would undoubtedly rush upon her without preparation. The shower was heavy but short, and it had not been over 5 minutes, when in came Harriet, with just the heated, agitated look which hurrying thither with a full heart was likely to give, and the "Oh, Miss Woodhouse, what do you think has happened?" which instantly burst forth, had all the evidence of corresponding perturbation. As the blow was given, Emma felt that she could not show greater kindness than in listening, and Harriet, unchecked, ran eagerly through what she had to tell. She had set out for Mrs. Goddard's half an hour ago. She had been afraid it would rain. She had been afraid it would pour down every moment, but she thought she might get to Hartfield first. She had hurried on as fast as possible. But then, as she was passing by the house where a young woman was making up a gown for her, she thought she would just step in and see how it went on. And though she did not seem to stay half a moment there, soon after she came out it began to rain, and she did not know what to do, so she ran on directly, as fast as she could, and took shelter at Ford's. Ford's was the principal woollen draper, linen draper, and haberdasher's shop united, the shop first in size and fashion in the place. And so, there she had sat, without an idea of anything in the world, full 10 minutes, perhaps, when all of a sudden who should come in? To be sure, it was so very odd! But they always dealt at Ford's. Who should come in but Elizabeth Martin and her brother? Dear Miss Woodhouse, only think! I thought I should have fainted. I did not know what to do. I was sitting near the door. Elizabeth saw me directly, but he did not. He was busy with the umbrella. I am sure she saw me, but she looked away directly, and took no notice, and they both went to quite the farther end of the shop, and I kept sitting near the door. Oh, dear, I was so miserable! I am sure I must have been as white as my gown. I could not go away, you know, because of the rain, but I did so wish myself anywhere in the world but there. Oh, dear Miss Woodhouse! Well, at last, I fancy, he looked round and saw me, for instead of going on with her buyings, they began whispering to one another. I am sure they were talking of me, and I could not help thinking that he was persuading her to speak to me. Do you think he was, Miss Woodhouse? For presently she came quite up to me, and asked how I did, and seemed ready to shake hands if I would. She did not do any of it in the same way that she used. I could see she was altered. But, however, she seemed to try to be very friendly, and we shook hands, and stood talking some time, but I know no more what I said. I was in such a tremble. I remember she said she was sorry we never met now, which I thought almost too kind. Dear Miss Woodhouse, I was absolutely miserable. By that time it was beginning to hold up, and I was determined that nothing should stop me from getting away, and then, only think! I found he was coming up towards me too, slowly, you know, and as if he did not know quite what to do. And so he came and spoke, and I answered, and I stood for a minute, feeling dreadfully, you know, one can't tell how, and then I took courage, and said it did not rain, and I must go, and so off I set, and I had not got 3 yards from the door when he came after me, only to say, if I was going to Hartfield, he thought I had much better go round by Mr. Cole's stables, for I should find the near way quite floated by this rain. Oh, dear, I thought it would have been the death of me, so I said I was very much obliged to him. You know I could not do less, and then he went back to Elizabeth, and I came round by the stables. I believe I did, but I hardly knew where I was, or anything about it. Oh, Miss Woodhouse, I would rather done anything than have it happened, and yet, you know, there was a sort of satisfaction in seeing him behave so pleasantly and so kindly. And Elizabeth, too. Oh, Miss Woodhouse, do talk to me and make me comfortable again. Very sincerely did Emma wish to do so, but it was not immediately in her power. She was obliged to stop and think. She was not thoroughly comfortable herself. The young man's conduct and his sister's seemed the result of real feeling, and she could not but pity them. As Harriet described it, there had been an interesting mixture of wounded affection and genuine delicacy in their behaviour. But she had believed them to be well-meaning, worthy people before, and what difference did this make in the evils of the connection? It was folly to be disturbed by it. Of course he must be sorry to lose her; they must all be sorry. Ambition, as well as love, had probably been mortified. They might all have hoped to rise by Harriet's acquaintance, and besides, what was the value of Harriet's description? So easily pleased, so little discerning, what signified her praise? She exerted herself, and did try to make her comfortable, by considering all that had passed as a mere trifle, and quite unworthy of being dwelt on. "It might be distressing for the moment," said she, "but you seem to have behaved extremely well, and it is over, and may never, can never, as a first meeting, occur again, and therefore you need not think about it." Harriet said, "Very true," and she would not think about it, but still she talked of it, still she could talk of nothing else, and Emma at last, in order to put the Martins out of her head, was obliged to hurry on the news, which she had meant to give with so much tender caution, hardly knowing herself whether to rejoice or be angry, ashamed or only amused, at such a state of mind in poor Harriet, such a conclusion of Mr. Elton's importance with her. Mr. Elton's rights, however, gradually revived. Though she did not feel the first intelligence as she might have done the day before, or an hour before, its interest soon increased, and before their first conversation was over, she had talked herself into all the sensations of curiosity, wonder and regret, pain and pleasure, as to this fortunate Miss Hawkins, which could conduce to place the Martins under proper subordination in her fancy. Emma learned to be rather glad there had been such a meeting. It had been serviceable in deadening the first shock, without retaining any influence to alarm. As Harriet now lived, the Martins could not get at her, without seeking her, where hitherto they had wanted either the courage or the condescension to seek her, for, since her refusal of the brother, the sisters had never been at Mrs. Goddard's, and a 12-month might pass without their being thrown together again, with any necessity, or even any power of speech. End of Volume 2, Chapter 3, read by Sibella Denton. For more information, please visit LibriVox.org.